Biscotti had no respect for quarterly projections. Poppy Hartwell had been on the Vareni estate for 9 days, which should have been long enough to learn that. It wasn't. The invoices were perfect. That was the part that mattered. 3 weeks of vendor receipts, staff payroll logs, and deferred maintenance costs, sorted by date, clipped by category, stacked in a clean pile on the kitchen counter, until Biscotti, 14 pounds of tortoise shell indifference, had walked across them at 7:42 that morning, scattered half onto the tile floor, and settled his enormous body on the remaining stack, as though daring anyone to have an opinion about it. The papers that escaped had travelled, because old estate houses were never quite level, all the way down the east hallway, to the threshold of the study. The study where, according to every employee who had whispered warnings to Poppy over her first 9 days, Lucio Varenne was currently in a meeting that no one interrupted. Ever. Under any circumstances, including fire. Poppy considered her options for approximately 4 seconds. The invoices represented 11 hours of work. Biscotti had already eaten the corner off one of them. She went after them. She gathered papers flat against the floor, working quickly and quietly, and might have succeeded entirely, except that she'd forgotten she was wearing Lucio's reading glasses. She'd found them on the kitchen table that morning and put them on without thinking while looking for her own pair. She'd been wearing them for 40 minutes. She was also, while reaching for the last invoice, on her hands and knees directly in front of the study door, when Biscotti walked through it with complete authority and pushed it open. Poppy looked up. 3 men in expensive suits looked back at her. One of them was Lucio Varenne. She was kneeling on his floor, arms full of crumpled invoices, wearing his reading glasses, with a 14-pound cat now sitting on her shoulder. Her first instinct was professional. She straightened as much as a person could while kneeling and said, "The March invoices were missing. Biscotti had them." Nobody moved. Lucio looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Biscotti, who was purring. Then Lucio Varenne laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was sudden and completely unguarded, the kind of laugh that doesn't consult anyone before it happens. The 2 other men in the room looked like they'd witnessed something physically impossible. One of them took a half step backward. Poppy removed the reading glasses and set them carefully on the corner of his desk. "I'll finish this somewhere else." She collected her invoices, stood and left. Biscotti stayed. The hallway outside the study was very quiet for about 5 seconds. Then Marguerite, one of the senior housekeepers, grabbed Poppy's arm. "He looked at you," she whispered. Poppy frowned. I was on the floor of his study. "He never looks at anyone." Marguerite released her arm and glanced back at the closed door with the expression of someone reconsidering a long-held belief. "Not like that." Poppy went back to the kitchen to reorganize her papers. She had been warned, within her first hour on the estate, about the study, about the meetings, about the correct response to hearing Lucio Varenne's voice in an adjacent room, which was to quietly become somewhere else. She had also been chasing an invoice for a $14,000 HVAC repair that someone had miscoded 3 consecutive quarters, and Biscotti had eaten the only copy of her notes. Priorities were priorities. Poppy Hartwell had arrived on a 3-month accounting contract to bring the household books into order. The previous bookkeeper had left abruptly. She had decided not to ask about that part. 14 months earlier, she had been co-owner of a catering company with her college roommate. They had been growing steadily. Corporate events, gallery openings, one wedding that had been written up in a regional magazine. Her partner had also been quietly moving client deposits into a separate account for nearly 2 years. By the time Poppy found it, there was nothing left to recover except the debt. She had sold her car, sublet her apartment, and taken every contract job she could find. This one paid well. She was very motivated not to get fired for crawling into her employer's private meeting. The kitchen door opened. Lucio Varenne stood in the doorway. He was taller than she'd registered from the floor. He wore charcoal grey as though it had been invented for him. His expression had returned to whatever its resting state was, controlled, deliberate, the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that emotion was inefficient. Miss Hartwell. She stopped reorganizing. Mr. Varenne. 9 days, he said. Yes. His eyes moved to the reconstructed stack of invoices. And in 9 days, no one thought to explain that my study is private. They did, she paused several times. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but a close relative. Yet you entered anyway. The HVAC invoice was miscoded 3 quarters in a row. At $14,000, that's a $42,000 error on the books. She held his gaze. And Biscotti was eating it. A silence. You may continue your work, Miss Hartwell. He left. Biscotti walked in from the hallway, jumped onto the counter, and knocked a pen to the floor. Poppy picked it up without comment. The next morning she arrived in the main dining room to find Lucio already at the breakfast table. She nearly reversed direction. She had already received one 15-minute conversation from the estate manager, Wendell Bryce, about professional conduct and appropriate deference to Mr. Varenne's time. Poppy had decided that sounded expensive. She poured the coffee and did not look at him directly. Good morning, Mr. Varenne. Miss Hartwell. He remembered her name. 2 serving staff exchanged a glance. Then Biscotti leaped onto the table, sat directly on the open newspaper, and stared at Poppy with the focused attention of someone expecting results. We discussed this, she said quietly. You have a dish. The cat blinked. Lucio lowered the edge of his newspaper to observe the situation. His dish is in the kitchen. He's aware. He disagrees with the location. Lucio looked at Biscotti. Biscotti looked at Poppy. He appears to find your opinion more binding than mine. He finds everyone's opinion relevant when it involves food. Poppy located a small bowl, added a splash of cream from the service cart, and placed it beside the coffee. Biscotti abandoned his protest immediately. Lucio watched this transaction. Negotiation, he said. Bribery, Poppy said. There's a moral difference. She saw it then. The corner of his mouth, just for a moment, before he controlled it and returned to his newspaper. She refilled his coffee and continued working. That was the beginning, not a scene, just coffee and a cat and a man whose face had done something almost human. What developed over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic. It was built entirely from small things, the kind that go unnoticed until suddenly they can't. 3 mornings after the breakfast incident, Poppy was in the estate library cross-referencing insurance renewals when Lucio came in mid-phone call. She immediately started gathering her work. He ended the call. You don't have to leave. She paused. I was under the impression you prefer empty rooms. Who told you that? Wendell. Wendell, he said, in a particular tone that communicated an entire editorial position in one word. Stay. She stayed. He opened a folder, neither spoke. 40 minutes passed before he left. 2 afternoons later, she found him standing in the kitchen, watching Biscotti attempt to extract a piece prosciutto from a sealed deli container. The cook had stepped out. Lucio stood with his hands in his pockets, observing the cat's efforts with something close to professional respect. How long has he been at that? Poppy asked. 6 minutes. She looked at Biscotti, then at Lucio. Have you considered opening it? I don't negotiate with cats. You've been watching him for 6 minutes. Lucio looked at her for a moment. Then he reached over and opened the container. Biscotti retrieved the prosciutto with great dignity and departed without acknowledging either of them. I had hoped, Lucio said, for some indication of gratitude. From Biscotti, Poppy said. That's optimistic. He almost smiled. The cook, who had slipped back in unnoticed, became very interested in something on the stove. It was Lucio's aunt who explained the part Poppy couldn't figure out on her own. Dorothea Varenne was 81 and spent her mornings in the conservatory with a jigsaw puzzle she had been working on, by Poppy's estimate, since sometime in the previous decade. She was the only person in the house who spoke to Lucio without first calculating the risk. Poppy brought her fresh tea on a Wednesday afternoon, unprompted. Dorothea looked up immediately. You're the one who made him laugh. Poppy nearly dropped the tray. Biscotti should get most of the credit. Biscotti has been here 14 years, Dorothea said. He has never made Lucio laugh. Poppy sat down because the conversation seemed to require it. Dorothea was quiet for a moment, looking toward the garden. He wasn't always like this, she said. Not soft. Lucio was never soft, but there was something underneath all the rest of it. He laughed easily when he was younger, especially with Matteo. Poppy went still. His brother, Dorothea said. She touched the rim of her teacup without lifting it. 12 years younger. They were very different people, but Matteo was one of the few who could interrupt one of Lucio's meetings and leave with all his teeth. A faint smile. He once replaced every formal photograph in the house with pictures of Biscotti wearing paper crowns while Lucio was traveling. Lucio came home at midnight, looked at all of them, made himself coffee, and went to bed without a word. Poppy smiled in spite of herself. What happened to him? Dorothea's expression changed. 11 years ago, Matteo was 23. He was caught in something that was meant for Lucio. She looked toward the window. He died before Lucio reached the hospital. Outside, rain began tapping quietly at the glass. Lucio believes it was his fault, Dorothea said. He has spent 11 years building his life around making sure it never happens again. More security, more distance, more control, more silence. She looked at Poppy. But a life organized entirely around prevention isn't really a life. It's just a very detailed kind of grief. Poppy thought about Lucio eating breakfast alone before she arrived each morning. About the way every room in the house seemed to hold its breath when he entered. About a mansion beautiful enough to be in a magazine and so quiet that a cat knocking a pen off a desk was an event. He loved his brother, Poppy said. He still does. Dorothea studied her. That is why I have never asked him to move on. You don't move on from people you love. You learn to carry the weight without letting it become the only thing you're carrying. Poppy was quiet for a moment, and he never learned that part. Not yet. Dorothea tilted her head, though perhaps recently he's been trying. Poppy shook her head. Mrs. Varenne, I'm not asking you to save him. The old woman's voice was kind but certain. People aren't household accounts, Miss Hartwell. They don't balance just because someone competent is working on them. Poppy laughed before she could stop it. Dorothea reached across the table and patted her hand. There you are. Wendell Bryce noticed the changes before Poppy fully understood what they meant. Lucio's breakfast location had shifted twice in 1 week. He had entered the kitchen voluntarily on 3 separate occasions. He had stayed in the library for 40 minutes while Poppy worked. And one morning, Wendell watched Lucio cross the main hall, hear Poppy laughing with the head groundskeeper about something involving Biscotti and a taupey pace. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly, before continuing on. Wendell summoned Poppy to his office by noon. He sat behind his clean desk with his hands folded. You've become comfortable with Mr. Varenne. Poppy waited. You address him casually. You remain in rooms he enters. You encourage disruptions to his routine. Biscotti's disruptions are self-directed. This isn't a conversation about the cat. Poppy looked at him steadily. She had owned a business. She had sat across from suppliers who assumed her warmth meant she couldn't read a contract. She recognized the shape of what Wendell was suggesting, and it landed somewhere tender. "You think I'm here for something other than the accounts." Wendell's expression was careful. "I think you understand exactly what you're doing." Poppy thought about being at the commercial kitchen by 4 in the morning, about negotiating vendor agreements after midnight, about smiling at a client while wondering if the payment processor would clear, about discovering that the person she trusted most had been quietly taking everything they'd built together for 2 years, while Poppy smiled and worked and didn't see it coming. She was not going to be called calculating by a man who had never built anything. "No," she said quietly, "I don't." She left without giving him the argument he'd been expecting. By that evening, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations paused when she walked into the staff dining room. The sous chef who had been saving her a mug somehow couldn't find it. No one was openly unkind. That almost made it worse. Poppy didn't confront Wendell. She worked. She helped finish a formal dinner for 14 when 2 kitchen staff called out sick. She covered a younger housekeeper's afternoon duties, so the woman could call her mother in the hospital. She got quieter. She smiled less. Lucio noticed on Thursday morning. "You used to argue at breakfast," he said when she poured his coffee. "Mr. Varenne," not Lucio. He heard the difference in one syllable. She turned away, he said quietly. "Poppy!" She stopped. It was the first time he'd used only her name. 3 staff members were present, watching without appearing to watch. She could feel it. "I'm practicing professionalism," she said. "Will that be all, sir?" A pause. Yes. That afternoon, Lucio found Remy in the East Corridor. "Has something happened with Miss Hartwell?" Remy took a moment. Lucio rarely asked questions he didn't already have the outline of an answer to. "There's been talk," Remy said, "about her relationship with your schedule." "Who started it?" Another pause. Wendell raised the concern. Lucio said nothing for a moment. He looked toward the corridor where Poppy had disappeared that morning. For 11 years, the distance in this house had been something he'd allowed to accumulate. Not demanded, just permitted, until it became the house's entire character. And now someone was being made to pay for refusing to maintain it. The realization sat very badly. That evening, Lucio Varenne walked into the staff dining room for the first time in over a decade. The room stopped breathing. He looked around the table. "Sit down." Everyone who had half risen sat. Poppy was standing near the coffee station with a piece of bread and the expression of someone calculating whether she had somehow caused this too. Lucio pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat in it. Someone dropped a fork. "Coffee," he said. 4 people reached for the pot. Poppy got there first. She filled his cup and murmured, low enough that only he caught it. "Most people say good evening before they give an entire room cardiac arrest." "Good evening," he said. She looked at him sideways. Progress. Remy, by the door, looked at the ceiling. Lucio buttered a piece of bread and stayed for 25 minutes. He said nothing about Wendell. He didn't address the talk. He simply sat beside Poppy at the table and let the room understand what that meant on its own terms. Every person in that room understood immediately. By morning, the atmosphere had reversed itself entirely. 3 weeks later, Poppy found something in the accounts that had nothing to do with biscotti. She had been reconciling 6 months of vendor contracts when she noticed a pattern. Consistent overpayments to a catering supplier, each one small enough to pass beneath standard review thresholds, large enough to add up significantly across 18 months. The payments ran through a channel connected to one of Lucio's mid-size commercial properties and bypassed the household books she managed directly. She cross-referenced twice, then a third time. Then she printed her notes and carried them to the East Wing. The man in the service corridor was wearing a catering company uniform. She had personally reviewed the vendor schedule that morning. No external catering was booked. "Wrong floor," she said. He turned. "Kitchen's downstairs." He'd answered a direction she hadn't given. Legitimate temporary workers spent their first 3 visits asking for directions. This man knew exactly where he was. She stepped backward. He registered that she understood. She didn't scream. She threw her coffee thermos at the wall. The sound it made in the narrow corridor was enormous. He grabbed her forearm. Poppy twisted the way her older brother had shown her in a parking lot when she was 19, because he had decided the world was not reliably safe, and she should know that. She broke free and hit the emergency panel at the end of the hall with her palm. The alarm erupted. Remy arrived in under a minute. Lucio was 45 seconds behind him. The man was on his knees when Lucio came through the door. Poppy stood against the wall. Her cardigan sleeve was torn. There was a red mark forming around her wrist. Lucio saw it. His face went completely still. Not the controlled stillness she'd come to read as his resting state. Something different, deeper, older. Who touched her? Remy indicated the man on the floor. Lucio took 1 step forward. Poppy said his name. He stopped. Not because of the man on the floor, because of her voice. "I'm all right." "Your wrist." I gave that to myself, pulling free of him. She held his gaze. "Look at me. I'm standing. I'm annoyed. I'm not broken." His jaw tightened. He looked at the torn sleeve and looked away. He knew the layout, Poppy said. She held up her notes. He knew which corridor connects to property records storage. "I found irregularities this afternoon. Consistent fraudulent payments running through your Belmont commercial account. This was connected to someone who's been bleeding money out slowly enough that no one noticed. Until now." Lucio looked at her notes, then at the man on the floor. He turned to Remy. "Call the appropriate people. Preserve everything. I want to know who authorized his access and who sent him." He looked at the man, "and find out who's receiving those payments." The man had expected something other than law enforcement. His expression showed it. Lucio looked back at Poppy. "Doctor." "My wrist," she said. "Doctor." "Fine. But if they suggest amputation, I'm getting a second opinion." Remy converted a reaction into a cough. Lucio exhaled for the first time in several minutes. Hours later, her wrist wrapped and confirmed as a mild sprain. Poppy found Lucio on the terrace. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the garden in the dark. She had expected controlled fury. What she found was a man who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "You should go inside," he said, without turning. "My wrist is the problem. My legs are fully operational." He glanced at the bandage, said nothing. "You couldn't have known," she said. "I should have found the account irregularity myself. My people should have. Your people manage an international operation. I found this because I was a forensic accountant working 18-hour days on one set of books, and I got lucky on the 3rd cross-reference." She stepped closer. "You don't get to make yourself responsible for everything that happens within reach of your life. That's not protection. That's just a more elaborate kind of suffering." He looked at her, then, and his expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "You were considering the other contract," he said. Poppy paused. 3 weeks ago, she'd taken a call about a position across the city. She hadn't decided. "Yes," she said. Lucio looked back at the garden. 11 years of walls. 11 years of systems and distance and carefully managed silence. All of it had not mattered 1 second after that alarm went off. "When I heard it," he said quietly, "my first thought was not the breach, not the documents." He paused. "My first thought was your name." Poppy stood very still. I haven't thought that way about anyone since Matteo. He turned to look at her fully. I don't entirely know what to do with that. Neither of them pretended it was a minor admission. For 3 days, neither of them mentioned the terrace. They didn't need to. Something had shifted between them, the way furniture shifts in a house. You can't see it move, but you stop being surprised when you find it somewhere new. Poppy still brought the morning coffee. Lucio still appeared in the kitchen on afternoons she worked late, using biscotti as a plausible explanation. On a Thursday evening, she found him in the library with an unopened folder on his desk. He looked up when she came in. "I spoke with Wendell today," he said. Her expression changed. "I didn't ask you to." "I know." He stood and moved toward the window. He believed he was protecting something. He was wrong about what that meant. A pause. "He apologized to the staff. He'll speak to you directly." Poppy studied him. "You could have let him go." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He turned toward her. "Because people should have the opportunity to become better than their worst decision. If that were not true, several people currently in this room would be in considerably worse circumstances." She looked at him for a long moment. "That was emotionally functional of you. Don't make a habit of saying that." She laughed. He almost smiled. The room felt like something had come back to it. He crossed toward her slowly. "Your contract ends in 3 weeks." "I know." "I know about the catering company," he said. "Everyone in this house is researched. I want you to know that I know." She went still. "I also know that you've spent over a year rebuilding your finances, without taking anything from anyone who didn't earn it from you first." He stopped in front of her. "I could pay what remains of your debt tonight. It would be nothing to me." Her expression shifted. "I'm not going to," he said, "because paying it wouldn't give you back what was taken from you. It would only remove another decision from your hands, and that is the last thing I want to do." Poppy looked at this man that the rest of the world was afraid to make eye contact with, and thought he understood exactly what she needed him not to do, without being asked, without being told. "I don't want you to stay because you need the contract," he said. "I don't want you here because of what happened in that corridor. I want you here because when you're not in this house, it becomes a room I don't want to be in." She said nothing. "I notice when there's no argument at breakfast. I notice when biscotti is in a bad mood, because you haven't been in the kitchen. I notice when you laugh somewhere in the house, and I change my route to walk past it." His voice lowered. "I spent 11 years building my life around noticing nothing. I don't want to do that anymore." Poppy looked at him for a long moment. "The cat," she said finally, "is going to be completely insufferable about this." Something in Lucio's expression released. "Biscotti has already won. I accepted that some time ago." She stepped forward and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around it with a carefulness that said he understood what he was holding. "I'm still rebuilding my own life," she said. "I wouldn't want you any other way. I'm going to argue with you, consistently. I assumed that was included." She smiled. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every moment to choose. She met him halfway. The kiss was brief, certain, and tasted like something that had been waiting long enough. When they separated, Biscotti was sitting in the doorway with Lucio's reading glasses in his mouth, watching them with the composed expression of someone who had planned the entire evening and was now ready for his fee. "You had one job," Poppy said. Lucio started laughing. Poppy went for the glasses. Biscotti walked away with enormous dignity, disappearing around the corner before anyone could pretend they had authority over him. 1 year later, the Vareni estate was different. Not loud in any careless way, not chaotic, simply alive in the way that houses are when people inside them have stopped being afraid of each other. Dorothea's birthday dinner had become, as these things do when a house finally remembers how to hold people, something larger than intended. Most of the staff present, a cake that the cook had clearly been planning for weeks, and biscotti wearing a ribbon bow he was systematically destroying from one end. Remy and the head groundskeeper were deep in a disagreement about which of them biscotti respected more. The answer was demonstrably neither. Lucio stood beside Poppy near the far window, watching Dorothea win 3 card games in a row with the serenity of someone who had decided the rules applied to everyone else. "She's cheating," he said. Dorothea, without looking up. "I am 82 years old, and I have earned every advantage I care to take." Poppy pressed her lips together. Lucio glanced at her. "Whose side are you on?" "Hers, unambiguously." "You always side with her." "She helped me understand you." He was quiet. His hand found the small of her back. The past year had not been simple. Matteo's anniversary in October was still quiet. The whole house understood that without being told. There were still mornings when 11 years showed in Lucio's face before his first coffee. Healing had never meant forgetting. It meant grief no longer had to run the entire property. Poppy had her own things. The catering debt was finished. She had made the last payment 6 weeks ago. From a savings account, she'd built one contract at a time, and the satisfaction of it had been the best feeling she'd had in over a year. She had since begun the paperwork for a small food consulting firm with a business loan she had researched and negotiated completely on her own. Lucio had read her business plan cover to cover, handed it back without comment, and shown up to her test kitchen's pilot session and purchased 11 individual pastries. She had accused him of artificially inflating her numbers. He had returned the following week and bought 7 more. She had eventually stopped arguing about it. Near the doorway, one of the younger staff watched Lucio laugh at something Dorothea said and turned to Remy. "Was he always like this?" Remy followed the young man's gaze. Lucio was attempting to rescue his reading glasses from biscotti with limited success. Poppy was watching without offering any assistance whatsoever. "No," Remy said. The younger man waited. Poppy had finally taken the glasses back, handing them to Lucio with the expression of someone who found the situation entirely predictable and quietly wonderful. He put them on, looked at her, and said something that made her laugh. A real laugh. The kind that didn't look around the room first to see if it was allowed. "He forgot how," Remy said. Across the room, Lucio caught Poppy's hand. She leaned into his shoulder without thinking about it. The way you lean on something you've stopped worrying will move. Someone noticed. Then someone else. Applause spread through the room the way it does when a room has been waiting a long time for something true to happen in it. Biscotti walked across the card table and sat on the remaining deck, ending the cheating debate with absolute finality. Dorothea watched all of it, with her eyes full of something she didn't try to hide. 11 years of silence had not ended because someone had fixed Lucio Varenne. It ended because someone had been too busy solving a legitimate accounting problem to perform any fear of him, and in the space between scattered invoices and a cat who had opinions about everything, he had slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly remembered that surviving and living were not the same thing, and that one of them was still worth choosing. He squeezed Poppy's hand. She squeezed back, and laughter traveled through every room of the Varenne estate, like it had always belonged there and had simply been waiting for someone to leave a door open.